Hello everyone, now let's move on. And most of us have read about a classic book named Hong Lo Mo, and in which there is a plot that we know, of course, many people hate Wang Xi Feng, but they all fear to talk it out loud. So people would invite a witch to paper cut a figure of Wang Xi Feng and burn it in flame. And this was the way to spell a curse on her. And this was actually a form and a usage of paper cutting in life, and it was the general usage of paper cutting in the past. There was no such thing as paper cutting in the ancient time until paper was invented and a color or pigment first appeared. And after that, people dyed the paper into colors like, say, red, and people cut it out and saw that they looked at that paper, they were so beautiful. So therefore they pasted on the windows. And during the spring festival or there were some weddings, and people started to call it 窗花 or flower on windows. The first paper cutting works that we unearthed was in a round shape, so we call it 团花 or cluster flowers. That's to say that the earliest paper cutting skill or works were mostly named 窗花 or 团花. And speaking of which, I mentioned some places that people like paper cutting, and I would briefly talk about those areas, and some cities and regions in northern China and some places in southern China. And in a province like Shanxi, for example, paper cutting has changed a lot, and the works were extraordinary. While in the city of Tianjin, there is a young artist named Yang Yu that everyone knows as a form of folk art. So his paper cutting works falls between the New Year pictures, and more often as time, we call it a kind of colorful paper cutting. He starts to cut the paper in single color, and according to the colors needed in the paper cutting, he pasted out layer by layer with colorful papers. And eventually it turns out to be a colorful paper cutting work. The paper cutting from Hebei province is rough and mainly dyed. So what exactly is dyeing? It is dyeing on white rice paper when it was carved. We also call it color-dotted paper cutting technique, as some patterns are dotted with pigment on paper itself. So, dyeing paper cutting is its unique characteristics. And next, we're going to talk about paper cutting in Weishan County of Hebei Province. The style of paper cutting in Weishan County is very different from that skill or art prevailing in other northern cities. The materials the paper works used is rice paper. Okay, so remember, it's used rice paper. And for a single use, people will get as many as 50 sheets of rice paper stacked and bound them together. The patterns of this kind of paper cutting is mainly 川花. And it is mostly characterized of what we call it dotted dyeing. So what is dotted dyeing? It is the same as using color or pigment to dot the paper. And so what about its technique in process is used in white rice paper and bind them up a stack of, say, 50 sheets. If the person is very skilled, he may use much more rice paper to get them stacked. The first step he will do is to damp all the rice paper. And then he will do something else, like the first he will do a draft of picture. So first things is he draw a picture and he would carve it out and then he would damp the paper again. Finally, he would try to sun-dry the wet paper and later bake them dry. And you might feel curious about this process works because a stack of 50 sheets of rice paper would condense together after being damped and dried. At this time, different colors and pigments are to be used according to the actual needs of each part. Well, in this part, I'm gonna introduce the paper cutting popular in Guangdong province. Foshan is a city famous for paper cutting in Guangdong province. And for Guangdong style of paper cutting, it has all sort of styles actually. The most reputed one is the specialty of a four-form paper cutting skill. One is plain color paper cutting, and plain color is what we call the paper cutting using just a single color, as we sometimes use red and sometimes we change black or blue. There's no other color that we are gonna use but only use a white paper from below, so that can reflect the above colors. We can basically understand the plain color paper cutting technique that everyone knows, which is used by a particular tool in southern China as we call it the skill of carving. So we see the focus is still on carving. And this type, when compared with paper cutting in other regions, is basically the same. And this kind of single-color paper cutting works are quite famous and popular in local regions. It looks very plain and elegant, and it looks neat and clean. So that's the single-color paper cutting, and which is one of the pure paper cutting forms. Another famous form here in the local region is called backing paper cutting. But its transformation in patterns is quite different from the northern paper cutting works, as it's based on the actual communication of a reality that we have to transform the patterns according to the real needs, and which shows a strong traditional sense of decorative paper cutting, which is very, very old. Now let's take a close look at this paper cutting work, and this is called San Yang Kai Tai, or we can explain as three rams bringing good luck. And we can find from this paper works in a unique Fujian style. It is remarkable. So you can take a close look at the three rams. And what you have seen in these rams, the paper cutting has its realistic side, that they look so real, but there's also a transforming and exaggerating technique in making these three rams. And the patterns are different in all three rams. They are all different. The patterns look like there is a sense of ram's feet, but we can also tell from it a kind of heavy decorations that you might feel what I said. Objects like the fruits, flowers, and birds around are all vividly depicted and showed, and this is also both an exaggerated and a realistic style of the portrait in paper cutting. Now, we're going to move around to appreciate some paper works from Fujian province. And this one is called Passing on the Fire from Generation to Generation. And we can not only see the ordinary life of local people from this paper cutting work, but also can we take the whole picture of the local scenery and the reality of life that you can find everywhere. Although the paper cutting is a kind of art developed and based on traditional cutting, but its past style was not what we have imagined, a kind of technique that stresses too much transformation. It was based on the sincere sense of reality and people's local life. So the paperworks turn out to be much more vivid cuttings as butterflies, magpies, and the flowers of various sorts, such as peony, spring flowers, and so on. A lot of sorts of flowers we see. This kind of paper cutting works can display its art forms of charm from its parts, and as a form of changhua, all we call the window flowers. So the hollowed out paper cutting techniques in the city of Yangzhou is more outstanding, and it is a reflection of the specific style in the city of Yangzhou as a folk art and through the years of development. Yangzhou-style paper cutting techniques has not been limited in cutting flowers and birds. It spares no efforts in portraying figures if the paper sheet is big enough. It's developed into a much more beautiful and charming form of folk art based on the traditional Yangzhou paper cutting, and which used the hollow-out technique is improved a great deal in depicting figures. And their works showed people's idea of different figures. That's the way they do it. And which is a very appropriate reflection of Yangzhou style paper cutting. So the Yangzhou paper cutting works we appreciate now is just like a pattern of graceful lady which is very young and beautiful. That we feel it in a tender, delicate, and fine gesture. Well, let's see Hangzhou. Hangzhou style paper cutting has a shorter history compared with other places in Zhejiang. However, according to the local record named Wulin Chronicles, Hangzhou-style paper cutting has existed for hundreds of years, which is the historical statement in the record. And so some people in Hangzhou already took paper cutting as a means of life. As earliest as in Southern Song Dynasty, it was even a kind of art to make money. They sold paperworks they cut for money and earned their livings. They did nothing else but they just do paper cuttings. And yet from the book saying that it was people from northern China that brought paper cutting skills to Hangzhou in Southern Song Dynasty, and Hangzhou was named as the seat of Linyan city at that time, and the then emperor of the Southern Song Dynasty fled his way to Hangzhou and finally settled himself down in this new capital. And by that time, a lot of people from Kaifeng, which was the capital of the previous dynasty, and northern China, including some paper-cutting craftsmen, fled to Hangzhou to live away from the war. And that's why they came along to bring their paper-cutting techniques and skills to arrive to Hangzhou. So the Hangzhou paper cutting was developed on the basis of Southern style. And the skill was fused with that belonged to the style of Northern China. That's all for this part. Thanks for watching.